Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I am the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria, and the University of Victoria is located on the indigenous lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt indigenous people here in what is known as Canada. And as a Dean of the Faculty of Education, I uphold my commitment to support indigenous peoples in their aspirations in education and self-governance. So today we're going to be talking about this moment that we're living right now, but I will start with a different kind of land acknowledgement that actually sets the tone for my presentation. And it's a land acknowledgement that acknowledges the land as a living entity, not a property or a resource to be exploited, a living entity that contains us, and therefore if the land is in distress, our bodies are also in distress. And I also need to acknowledge that because I was born in Brazil in a mixed heritage family, when it comes to the winter, in the global north, my body really responds in a very difficult way. It was not made for the darkness here, so I do have seasonal affective disorder, and that's why today probably I won't be as upbeat as I am normally in other seasons of the year. So that's one of the ways that the land affects us. The second acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of our ancestors, those who have come before us and those who are yet to come, and our responsibility to honor our ancestors that came before us by correcting their mistakes, and to honor our responsibilities to come for those who come after us by saying the buck stops here. So I'm not going to be reproducing all this intergenerational trauma that I have inherited. I'll try to process as much as possible. The third acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that for us to be here today, we are dependent on a lot of systemic and structural violence, including the violence of mining for the minerals of these computers that make it possible for me to talk to you. And this acknowledgement of complicity in violence is not about shame or guilt. It is about leverage for us to feel responsible to do something different, to stop and interrupt that violence. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we're all a family of human and non-human beings that is experiencing dis-ease right now. It's a very complicated moment, and that the pain of the land, of what we're doing to each other, of all the turmoils that humanity is experiencing. So we need to acknowledge that there is a lot of pain. This pain needs to be held and processed collectively, but not in a way that allows us to drown in the sadness, anger, frustration, and despair of it. So the presentation today is about that. It's about how to hold space for a world in crisis, in stacked crisis. Some people call it polycrisis, others call it meta-crisis, others call it perma-crisis. So I will share my presentation and we'll take it from there. So this presentation is titled Navigating Complexity, Complicity, and Collapse with Compassion and Accountability. And this is the subtitle of a book that comes after this book that you see on the screen. This book is called Hospice in Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. And here are two quotes from the book. The first one is that there is no possibility of relevant education or genuine hope if we cannot sit with all aspects of our shared realities, the good, the bad, the broken, and the seriously messed up. So the book asks, what kind of education can help us build the intellectual, affective, and relational muscles that can collectively enable us to face the complexity of multiple realities, to learn from past and ongoing mistakes, and to open up the possibility for different futures to emerge. So this work is grounded in the inquiries and experiments of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Arts Research Collective. And this collective consists of transdisciplinary, multi-generational, it's transdisciplinary, multi-generational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and Indigenous and Afro-descendant knowledge keepers that works at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of current modern colonial systems. It brings together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, economic instability, wealth disparity, global mental health crisis, climate and biodiversity catastrophes, intensifications of social and ecological violence and inequalities, and the likelihood of wider social and ecological collapse in our lifetime. So it's very heavy, the content, and therefore we try to build containers, educational and artistic containers. So we are engaged in educational and artistic collaborative inquiry and experiments that build containers for the expansion of our collective capacity and stamina to face difficulty and pain and navigate complicity and complexity without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, demanding quick fixes, or to be rescued from discomfort, and without drowning in sadness, anger, frustration, guilt, or shame. So while it's recognized that vulnerabilities are unevenly distributed, no one is left off the hook. So there's a commitment to moving beyond essentialisms and the idealization of identities to a self-implicating critique, even if you are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And we work with a loop reciprocity model. So the income generated from our talks, workshops, and courses is redistributed to a network of Indigenous communities in Brazil and Peru who inspire and support our work. And this network is called T5C, Teia das Cinco Curas. So here are some of the people at the forefront of the work in Latin America that we work with. For example, Chief Linauainu Hunikui from Acre, from the Amazon, who's a global advocate against the financialization of forests and carbon trading in the Amazon. There's also Maria Yara Querar of Vale Sagrado, who's a community leader in protests against lithium mining in indigenous territories. So if you don't know, like the green revolution depends on lithium and other rare minerals, and these minerals are often mined in indigenous communities without their consent. And there's also Mateus Tremembé from Ceará in Brazil, who's a national leader against offshore wind farms in indigenous waters, and he's also a national food sovereignty advocate. So that you know who we're working with and who we are supporting in their work, and who also support the work that we do. So from their analysis of what's going on in the world, they say that it's not a problem of information, but of denial. And they have identified 4 socially sanctioned denials. The first is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. They happen at the expense of other people, other species, and of the land. The second is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. The third is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and from the land, rather than entangled within a living wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we will need to face together. The tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that may address symptoms but not the root causes of our collective hypercomplex, wicked predicament. So when we think about education as something that addresses lack of information, right? So when we present the information, the problem is solved. But when we think about education as something that addresses denial, that's very different. That's a very different process of education, because if you just present what's being denied, what happens is that there's a lot of resistance, and sometimes even aggressive resistance to what you are presenting. So in education that addresses denial, we have to find a way to bypass, to work around the defenses of the ego. And that's the kind of containers that we have tried to create. They are containers that help us to sit with what's difficult without responding from that defensive space. And we have a pedagogical inquiry in our collective that asks a number of questions, and some of them are here. These are the questions that ground the second book, actually. So the first question is, what if you knew in your skin, in your flesh, in your bones, not just in your head, and what if you could stay with that knowledge, that major, wider social and ecological collapse is inevitably in the horizon, and that in 10 to 20 years or less, what is familiar today will no longer be viable? And what if we could collectively respond today from a cultural space of emotional serenity or sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational and interspecies responsibility? What would you or we be doing or advocating for then? And when the children born today look back 30 years from now, what actions would they be grateful that we took right now? There's another question here about emotional serenity, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational and interspecies responsibility, which is the question about how is it that our current education cannot culturally move us in that direction? Why are we moving in the opposite direction of that? And we also come from an analysis of our social and educational context that acknowledge the effects of post-modernity, or of liquid modernity. So if we think about our context 30 years ago, when I was growing up, for example, we will see that a lot has changed. A lot has changed in the relationship to knowledge, to identities, to reality. And we have identified 10 of these changes that are very different. So if we use the same methods we were using in the 90s or early 2000s to address education, they are not going to work if we don't acknowledge that this context is very different. So these are 10 different ways in which the context is different that are important when we're designing educational processes. The first one is that we live in a chaotic cacophony of perspectives that make consensus, enduring consensus, very improbable. And also it's a context where we have unstable authorities. Any authority that emerges from here is going to be contested and challenged. It's also a context of reactive polarization. Number 3 is semantic proliferation. This means that people have learned to use words very differently. They know that words are social conventions and they have many different layers of meaning. And so we can create different conventions around words, and therefore it's very difficult now to agree on something and not see that it's moving as we go, right? And this has positive and negative effects. But one of the effects is that sometimes we want words to mean what we want them to mean, and then this causes a lot of word policing and discursive confusion. But the positive aspect also is that if we can engage with or relate to the language as a moving thing, as an entity that moves us, that moves with us, also other possibilities open up. And that is addressed in the book. Number 4 is multiple and multiplying moving layers of complexity. So in formal education, we are taught to, when we see multiple layers, we collapse these layers into one layer, we impose a narrative of coherence, we edit out what doesn't fit, and we police the borders. And this then creates a context of a pressure cooker in the context of hypercomplexity, where there are all these layers coming up and we don't know what to do with them. So before we see lentils everywhere, it's very important that we find a way to open up this collapsed layer of coherence and learn to stay with the complexity and the paradoxes and the contradictions without trying to impose coherence all the time. That is important for us not to feel so anxious about keeping that pressure cooker closed. There's also a context, number 5, of unprocessed hyperconsumption. So we're consuming a lot of information, knowledge, critique, experiences, relationships, but this causes a lot of indigestion. So we have a big constipation of things that are unprocessed. So we need to learn to process that. Number 6, there's a general lack of capacity to process complex emotions. We are told that we have to, again, have coherent emotions when actually our emotions are very complex and paradoxical. Then number 7, there's an excess of delicious distractions and incentives for numbing to reality. and alienation. Number 8, there are echo chambers, individual curation of reality. There's this context of post-truth and deep fakes that, of course, populist governments weaponize. Number 9, there are wider intergenerational gaps. There's resentment and entrenchment, of course, because the younger generations are receiving a world that is pretty messed up, and now they blame other generations for that. And number 10, there are new existential threats of climate and biodiversity catastrophes. There's also the threat of uncontrolled or unhinged artificial intelligence and escalating wars. So, what do we do in this context? First, we need to acknowledge that all these layers of complexities and complicities feel very heavy in our back. So there are systemic, historical, intergenerational, personal, and interpersonal complexities that we're carrying without the means to be able to process that. And then we try to hold on to these unstable certainties. So we would need a kind of education that helps us take that weight off our back safely. And if you're a weightlifter, you know that this is not as easy as it seems. You have to build the muscles and the strength of the ligaments and flexibility to do that, but you need to take it off our backs, put it in front of us, and try to lower it to the ground safely so that it can be collectively witnessed and processed. So that's the kind of education that would be necessary right now, rather than one that just tries to reinforce certainties and a simplistic form of hope that everything is going to be okay. So in thinking about this kind of education, we have several experiments and entry points to talk about that, but I have chosen one entry point to talk to you about, which is an invitation for 7 steps back and 7 steps forward or aside. So this education that is necessary for bringing the weight of complexity in front of us would require us or invite us to step back from our own self-image, to decenter the ego-logical desires that we have and center the challenge at hand. The second invitation is the invitation to step back from one's generational cohort, to have a sense of how incoming generations may interpret and experience the challenges differently. The third invitation is to step back from the universalization of our social, cultural, economic parameters of normality, to understand that one's privilege is a loss of perspective and sensibility. Number 4 is stepping back from the immediate context and time to see the wider historical, structural, and systemic patterns at work. Number 5 is stepping back from normalized patterns of problem posing, problem solving, and relationship building to tap what is already viable but unimaginable or unintelligible in the mainstream. Number 6 is stepping back from the elevation of humanity above the rest of nature to consider our metabolic entanglement with the planet. And number 7 is stepping back from the impulse to find quick fixes in order to expand our capacity not to be immobilized by complexity, complicity, and uncertainty. And there are also 7 invitations to step forward or aside. The first one is to step forward or aside with honesty and courage to see what we don't want to see. Number 2 is stepping forward or aside with humility to find strength in openness and vulnerability. Number 3 is stepping forward or aside with self-reflexivity so that we can read how we are being read and learn to read the room. Number 4 is stepping forward or aside with self-discipline to do the work on ourselves so that we don't become work for other people. Number 5 is stepping forward or aside with maturity to do what is needed rather than only what we want to do, and to become good elders and ancestors for all relations. Number 6 is stepping forward or aside with expanding discernment and attention, increasing care in proportion to risk. And number 7 is stepping forward or aside with adaptability, flexibility, stamina, and resilience for the long haul. And be prepared to fall, to fail, to have your plans shattered, to be stretched, to change course, and to find joy in the struggle itself rather than in the imagined prize at the end. So back to the book. I have other quotes here. So the book talks about the urgency to develop our collective capacity to hold the grief of being alive right now with an earth in pain without falling into immobility and depression. And this happens by interrupting systemically imprinted, which are conscious, unconscious, and neurobiological patterns that are born, that are both harmful and delicious, and by activating cognitive, affective, and relational capacities that have been exiled from the modern colonial system. So I'll leave you with that today. Here are three of the resources that we have out there. The first is the book, Hospice in Modernity. There's also a report called Moving with Storms that is freely available on the link on the screen. And then there's a course also called Facing Human Wrongs, Climate Complexity and Relational Accountability that is offered through the University of Victoria to the wider community. It's an online course, anybody can do it, and we have the next cohort starting in January. So thank you for holding space with me today. I wish you a great Tessnet conference, and that you embrace the path by opening up the space to be able to hold what's difficult, what's complicated and complex, without with the love and care, right, of really wanting to process all this inherited intergenerational stuff that is blocking the possibilities for us to coexist differently in the planet. Thank you.